Hey everyone, welcome back to Cruise for You. Whether this is your first time here or you've been with me for a while, I'm so happy to have you along. We've got a lot to talk about today, so grab a coffee, settle in, and let's dive into everything that's happening in the world of cruising right now. Here's what's coming up in this video. Carnival Cruise Line is rolling out some new booking rules for younger travelers, and they're cracking down in a way that's got a lot of people talking. If you're planning a trip with teens or kids, this is definitely something you'll need to know about. We're also going to talk about Disney Cruise Line because they've just announced an increase in gratuities. I'll break down what that means for you, how much extra you'll need to budget, and what this change is all about. Then there's Iceland, an absolutely stunning destination that so many of us dream about visiting. They've implemented a new daily fee for cruise passengers, and we'll unpack why they're doing it, how much it costs, and whether or not it's worth it. And we'll also touch on a surprising update out of the UK for travelers flying through London and Manchester. If you're planning a layover or connecting flight, there's a new rule you'll want to hear about. Finally, we've got an intense story from Italy. It's not the kind of news you expect from the cruise world, but it's an important one. We'll talk about what happened, how it affects construction on a brand new Princess Cruises ship, and what it says about life behind the scenes at a shipyard. So yeah, there's a lot to unpack. And I want to make sure you walk away from this video feeling informed and ready for your next adventure, whether you're cruising tomorrow or just dreaming about your next trip. Before we get started, I just want to say how much I appreciate every single one of you. Your support, whether it's through watching these videos, sharing your thoughts in the comments, or just being part of this community, means everything to me. If you find this video helpful, please take a moment to give it a like. It's a small thing, but it makes a big difference in helping more people discover Cruise for You. And if you haven't already, consider subscribing. I cover all kinds of cruise updates, tips, and stories to keep you in the loop and ready for your next adventure. Plus, I'd love to have you as part of this growing community. All right, let's get into it. From new rules to hidden fees to some pretty unexpected news, we've got a lot to cover. Let's break it all down together. Let's start with Carnival Cruise Line because they've made some big changes to their booking policies for younger passengers, and it's sparking a lot of discussion. Here's what's going on. Starting February 1st, if you're under 21, you can't just book a cruise and call it a day. You'll now need to travel with a relative or a guardian who's at least 25 years old. That's not a suggestion, it's a requirement. And they're adding even more rules about where people stay on the ship. If you're 14 or younger, you'll need to be in the same cabin as your guardian, or in one that's directly connected. So those days of spreading out across different staterooms? They're over for younger kids. Now, if you're a teenager, between 15 and 17, you can still have your own cabin, but only if it's no more than 3 doors down from your guardian's room. Here's why this matters. Before, there weren't strict rules about proximity. You could book a stateroom across the hall or even in a completely different section of the ship, and no one really checked. But Carnival is tightening the reins, and it's clear this is about preventing certain behaviors. Think about it. By keeping kids and teens closer to their guardians, they're aiming to cut down on some of the issues they've been dealing with. And let's be honest, this is probably also about addressing things like people trying to bypass drink package rules by swapping cabins. Now, if you already booked your cruise before February 1st, don't worry. These new rules won't apply to you. But moving forward, this is the new standard. It's an interesting shift, and I can see both sides of it. On the one hand, it makes sense from a safety and accountability perspective. But on the other hand, I know this might feel restrictive for families or groups who are used to having more flexibility. What do you think? Is this a smart move, or is Carnival overcomplicating things? Let me know. Next up, Disney Cruise Line. They've announced some changes too, but this time it's all about gratuities. Starting now, the cost of gratuities is going up, and depending on where you're staying on the ship, the increase could feel pretty significant. For most guests, those in non-concierge rooms, the gratuities are increasing by $1.50 per person per day. That brings the total to $16 per day, which doesn't sound like a huge jump until you start multiplying it by the number of people in your group and the length of your trip. Now, for concierge guests, the increase is even steeper. Gratuities in that category are going up by $3.75, which means you'll now be paying $27.25 per person per day. And yeah, that adds up fast if you're traveling as a family or with a group. It's important to remember that gratuities go directly to the crew, housekeepers, dining staff, and so on. These are the people who work incredibly hard to make your experience on the ship as smooth and enjoyable as possible. But let's be real, no one likes surprise price hikes, especially when you're already paying a premium to sail with Disney. So, while this increase is understandable, it's definitely something to budget for if you're planning a Disney cruise in the near future. And if you've already booked your trip, double-check to see if the gratuities are prepaid or if you'll need to cover that cost on board. Now let's shift gears a little and talk about Iceland. They're rolling out a new daily fee for cruise passengers, and this one's interesting because it's tied directly to sustainability and infrastructure. Starting this year, anyone visiting Iceland on a cruise ship will be charged $8 per port visit. That fee applies whether you're just docking for the day or staying overnight, and it doesn't matter if you get off the ship or not, it's per passenger, per visit. Some cruise lines, like MSC, are already notifying passengers about this, so don't be surprised if you see the fee added to your onboard account. Iceland is saying the money will go toward infrastructure improvements and sustainability efforts, which makes sense given the country's focus on preserving its natural beauty. And honestly, $8 per day doesn't seem unreasonable, especially when you consider how much it costs just to get to Iceland in the first place. But I know fees like this can add up, especially if you're visiting multiple ports on the same trip. What's your take? Is $8 a fair price to help maintain these destinations, or does it feel like another way for cruise lines to pass costs on to passengers? Let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear your perspective. Speaking of travel requirements, let's quickly touch on the UK. If you're flying through London Heathrow or Manchester, here's some good news. You no longer need an electronic travel authorization, ETA, for layovers. That's a pretty big deal for anyone who's just passing through these airports on their way to another destination. That said, I always recommend being prepared for the unexpected. Flights get delayed, weather happens, and sometimes you end up needing to stay overnight when you weren't planning to. So, even though you don't need an ETA right now, it's still a good idea to get one if your travel plans take you through the UK. Better safe than sorry, right? And finally, we've got a pretty intense story out of Italy. Over at the Fincantieri shipyard, where Princess Cruises' Star Princess is being built, there was a violent altercation between two workers. This happened early in the morning. A 24-year-old worker stabbed his 28-year-old colleague with a small fruit knife. Thankfully, the injuries weren't life-threatening, and the victim has already been released from the hospital. The attacker, however, was arrested on charges of aggravated assault. Now, what's interesting is that this incident hasn't impacted construction on the ship at all. Work is continuing as planned, and the Star Princess is still on track to debut in October. But it's definitely a reminder that even in these highly controlled environments, things can go sideways in unexpected ways. It's a bit of a sobering note to end on, but it's part of the reality behind the scenes. So there you have it, some major updates and stories from the cruise world. Whether it's new rules, fee hikes, or unexpected events, there's always something happening. Let me know what you think about all of this. Are these changes good, bad, or somewhere in between? And if you're planning a cruise soon, keep these updates in mind so you're not caught off guard. Thanks for sticking with me today, and I'll catch you in the next one. Safe travels.